Why does one man refuse to think like everyone else? For more than 2 decades, the world has watched Cristiano Ronaldo do what few human beings have ever done. The trophies piled up, the records fell, the headlines never stopped. Year after year, season after season, he continued doing something that should have become impossible long ago. He kept winning. To most people, the explanation seems obvious. Talent, discipline, genetics, opportunity, luck. Pick your favorite answer, and it will probably contain some truth. But there is a deeper question hiding beneath the surface, a question that statistics cannot fully answer, a question that becomes more fascinating the longer you think about it. Why does Cristiano Ronaldo continue pushing himself after achieving what most athletes spend their entire lives chasing? Why continue suffering through training sessions when the money has already been earned? Why continue competing when fame has already been secured? Why continue proving himself when millions already acknowledge his greatness? For most people, success is a destination. For him, it appears to be something else entirely. And this is where the mystery begins. Because the more closely you examine Ronaldo, the less he resembles a conventional athlete. Athletes usually compete against opponents. Ronaldo often seems to be competing against something far more abstract. A standard, an image, a vision of himself that exists somewhere in the future. This is why his story is not merely about football. It is about psychology. It is about identity. It is about the strange way certain individuals view reality. Most people spend their lives reacting to circumstances. They adjust their ambitions according to what seems possible. They negotiate with limitations. They seek reassurance before taking action. They wait for evidence before believing. But every so often, someone appears who reverses the process. Someone who believes first, and then spends years forcing reality to catch up. That is why Ronaldo is so fascinating, not because he is perfect, not because he never fails, but because his mindset appears fundamentally different from the mindset most people inherit from society. Consider something uncomfortable. How much of your life has been shaped by the opinions of other people? How many decisions were influenced by fear of judgment? How many ambitions were quietly abandoned because they seemed unrealistic? Most people spend years seeking approval. Approval from family, approval from friends, approval from strangers, approval from society itself. And the strange thing is that approval rarely satisfies anyone for long. The more you depend on it, the more you need. The more you receive, the more fragile you become, because your identity no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the crowd. Yet, when you observe individuals who rise to extraordinary heights, a different pattern often emerges. They are not free from criticism. In fact, they often attract more criticism than anyone else, but they seem less controlled by it. Their sense of self comes from somewhere deeper. Ronaldo's career reveals this repeatedly. Every setback became fuel, every criticism became motivation, every doubt became another challenge to overcome. Not because he enjoyed suffering, but because his identity appeared stronger than the obstacles surrounding him. And perhaps this is where many people misunderstand success. They believe confidence creates achievement. They believe extraordinary people wake up each morning feeling certain, feeling fearless, feeling invincible. But what if that isn't true? What if success begins when you stop waiting to feel confident? What if the real transformation occurs when your identity becomes more important than your emotions? When commitment becomes stronger than doubt? When purpose becomes stronger than fear? Because confidence comes and goes. Motivation comes and goes. Emotions come and go. Identity stays. And the people who accomplish extraordinary things often protect their identity with remarkable intensity. They know who they are before the world agrees. They act before the evidence arrives. They move before certainty appears, which leads us to a powerful realization. The strongest person in the room is often the one who no longer needs permission. Permission to dream, permission to act, permission to believe, permission to become. And perhaps that is the first clue to understanding Ronaldo. Perhaps he was never chasing approval. Perhaps he was chasing alignment between who he believed he was and what he could become. But if that is true, then his mindset is not merely the mindset of an athlete. It resembles something much older, something that rulers, conquerors, generals, and empire builders understood long before modern psychology ever existed. A psychological principle that has shaped history for centuries. Because the individuals who leave the deepest marks on the world often share one dangerous belief. They refuse to see themselves as ordinary. And to understand why Ronaldo thinks like a king, we must first understand why kings think the way they do. The ancient mindset hidden inside modern success. Throughout history, kings were often remembered for their armies, their wealth, or the territories they conquered. But those were merely the visible symbols of power. The real source of their power existed long before the crown touched their heads. It existed in their minds. History reveals something strange about the people who rise above ordinary limitations. Whether they ruled kingdoms, led revolutions, built empires, or transformed entire industries, they shared a psychological trait that separated them from everyone else. They believed they belonged at the center of events, not because the world told them so, because they told themselves so. This is one of the oldest and most misunderstood forces in human history. Kings were not simply people who possessed power. They were people who believed they deserved power. That belief came first. The kingdom came later. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli observed something uncomfortable about leadership. While most people imagine leaders as individuals blessed with certainty, history often tells a different story. The majority of people wait. They wait for better conditions. They wait for more confidence. They wait until the risks disappear. They wait until success seems likely. But the people who shape history rarely have the luxury of certainty. They move while others hesitate. They act while others analyze. They impose a vision on reality instead of asking reality for permission. This pattern appears again and again. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon before he knew the outcome. Napoleon marched into battles, surrounded by uncertainty. Entrepreneurs invest before guarantees exist. Inventors create before the world understands them. Every major transformation begins with someone acting before certainty arrives. And perhaps this is where Ronaldo becomes psychologically fascinating. From a young age, he displayed something that cannot be measured by statistics, an internal narrative, a private story about who he believed he was becoming. Many children dream about greatness, few expect it. There is an important difference. Wanting success and expecting success are not the same psychological experience. When the mind sees victory as merely possible, effort becomes optional. When the mind sees victory as inevitable, effort becomes a necessity. The brain begins organizing behavior differently. Decisions change, sacrifices become easier, discomfort becomes meaningful. This is why expectation is one of the most powerful forces in psychology. People often underestimate the stories they tell themselves, yet those stories quietly shape everything. The student who believes they are intelligent studies differently. The entrepreneur who believes they will succeed persists longer. The athlete who believes they belong among champions trains with a different intensity. This phenomenon is often called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Beliefs influence actions, actions influence outcomes, outcomes reinforce beliefs, and the cycle continues. What begins as an idea slowly becomes reality. Another psychological principle appears here, the internal locus of control. Most people unconsciously attribute their lives to external circumstances. Luck, politics, the economy, other people's decisions. While these forces matter, individuals with an internal locus of control focus elsewhere. They focus on what remains within their influence, their effort, their preparation, their response, their standards. This mindset does not guarantee success, but it creates something even more important. Agency, the belief that your actions matter, and agency is often the foundation of achievement. Ronaldo's career repeatedly reflects this principle. Instead of defining himself by limitations, he defined himself by possibilities. Instead of allowing circumstances to determine identity, he allowed identity to determine behavior. This is what psychologists call identity-based behavior. Most people act according to their current situation. A smaller group acts according to the person they believe they are becoming. The difference appears subtle, but it changes everything. Kings understood this. Conquerors understood this. Elite competitors understand this. They rarely define themselves by present circumstances. They define themselves by future inevitabilities. Before victory exists externally, it exists internally. Before recognition arrives, belief arrives. And perhaps you have noticed this phenomenon yourself. Have you ever noticed how some people enter a room as if they belong there before they've earned the right? Not arrogance, not entitlement, something deeper, a quiet assumption that they belong. That assumption often changes how others respond to them. The world is strangely influenced by certainty. People trust conviction, they follow confidence, they react to identity. But here lies the danger. Because every powerful mindset contains a shadow. The same psychological machinery that creates greatness can also create obsession. The same unwavering belief that drives achievement can make a person incapable of stopping. The same certainty that builds empires can destroy them. And when identity becomes inseparable from success, the pursuit of excellence can evolve into something much darker, something far more personal. Because eventually the battle is no longer against competitors. It becomes a battle against yourself. Why pain creates some people and destroys others. There is a moment that quietly divides human lives into different paths. It is not a moment of victory. It is not a moment of recognition. It is a moment of rejection. A moment when reality delivers a message you never wanted to hear. You are not chosen. You are not wanted. You are not enough. Most people remember these moments for the pain they caused, but history suggests something more disturbing. The event itself is rarely what determines the future. The interpretation does. Long before Cristiano Ronaldo became one of the most recognized athletes on the planet, he was a child growing up on the island of Madeira. The world did not know his name. There were no stadiums chanting for him, no trophies, no millions of followers, only uncertainty. His family struggled financially. Opportunities were limited. At a young age, he left home to pursue football, separating himself from familiar comforts and the people he loved. Imagine that reality for a moment. Not the celebrity, not the success, the loneliness, the distance, the feeling of being a child surrounded by expectations larger than himself. Most people see achievement and assume confidence came first. Often, the opposite is true. Many extraordinary people are forged in environments that constantly remind them of what they lack, and this creates a psychological crossroads. When rejection enters your life, two stories become available. The first story is common. I am not enough. This story is seductive because it explains everything. Every failure becomes evidence. Every setback becomes proof. Every disappointment strengthens the narrative. The second story is far less common. I will become impossible to ignore. The event is identical, the meaning is different, and meaning changes destiny. You have probably experienced rejection yourself. Perhaps you were overlooked. Perhaps someone doubted you. Perhaps your ambitions were dismissed before they had the chance to grow. Maybe you worked hard and received no recognition. Maybe you tried to belong and discovered you didn't fit. Maybe you revealed your true self and were met with indifference. These moments leave marks. The question is not whether they leave marks. The question is what those marks become. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who survived some of the darkest experiences imaginable, arrived at a profound insight. Human beings are not defined solely by events. They are defined by the meaning that they assign to those events. Two people can endure the same hardship and emerge as completely different individuals. One becomes trapped, the other becomes transformed. Not because their circumstances differed, because their interpretations differed. This is where many people unknowingly construct their identities, not around possibilities, around wounds. A betrayal becomes a permanent personality trait. A failure becomes a lifelong limitation. An embarrassment becomes a hidden prison. Years pass, yet the original event continues controlling decisions from the shadows. The wound becomes the identity, And identities are powerful. They influence behavior long after the original pain disappears. But some individuals refuse this process. Instead of building an identity around suffering, they build an identity around overcoming suffering. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" they begin asking, "What can this make me become?" This appears repeatedly in Ronaldo's story. The criticism, the doubts, the pressure, the endless comparisons. None of these experiences removed his ambition. If anything, they intensified it. Because pain, when interpreted correctly, can become fuel. Not pleasant fuel, not healthy fuel in every case, but powerful fuel. The desire to prove yourself is one of the strongest motivational forces in existence. It has launched careers, built companies, won championships, changed history. Yet there is a hidden danger. Living only to prove people wrong eventually becomes exhausting. The victory never feels complete. The validation never lasts. The critics never disappear. Which is why the deepest transformations happen when the motivation evolves. When proving others wrong becomes less important than fulfilling a personal mission. This is the moment pain changes form. It stops being a burden. It becomes training. Pain becomes power when it stops becoming an excuse. Read that carefully. Pain becomes power when it stops becoming an excuse. Many people carry painful experiences. Few people convert them into strength, because conversion requires responsibility. It requires refusing to let suffering become your identity. And that is difficult. Far more difficult than blaming circumstances. Consider a question. What would happen if the thing that hurt you most became the thing that trained you best? What if rejection taught resilience? What if loneliness taught self-reliance? What if failure taught discipline? What if criticism taught focus? Suddenly the meaning changes, and when meaning changes, identity begins to change. There is a reason the world often rewards people who transform emotional vulnerability into strategic strength. Not because they are emotionless, not because they suppress pain, because they understand it. They study it. They learn how to redirect it. The strongest people are rarely those who escaped suffering. They are often those who learned how to use it. But there is another side to this story. Because once pain becomes fuel, a dangerous possibility emerges. The engine never wants to stop. The hunger grows, the standards rise, the pursuit becomes personal. And eventually, what began as motivation can transform into something far more consuming, something that resembles obsession, when confidence becomes reality distortion. There is a thin line between confidence and delusion. From a distance, they often look exactly the same. Both speak with certainty. Both ignore doubt. Both move forward, despite criticism. The difference usually becomes visible only after the outcome is known. History celebrates the confident when they succeed. It calls them visionaries. History mocks the confident when they fail. It calls them fools. Yet the psychological mechanism behind both remains remarkably similar. A powerful belief in one's own ability to shape reality. This is one of Cristiano Ronaldo's most controversial traits. Not his athleticism, not his discipline, his confidence. For years, critics have called it arrogance. Supporters have called it self-belief. Others have seen it as ego. But perhaps all of these interpretations miss something deeper. Many people misunderstand what confidence actually is. They assume confidence means believing you will succeed. But true confidence often means something far more profound. It means behaving as if failure cannot redefine you. Think about the difference. Most people avoid risks because they fear what failure will say about them. A failed project becomes proof they are incapable. A rejection becomes proof they are unworthy. A setback becomes proof they are inadequate. Failure is not merely an event, it becomes an identity, and that is why it hurts. But individuals with extraordinary self-belief operate differently. Failure remains painful, it remains frustrating, but it does not alter the core story they tell themselves. Their identity absorbs failure rather than collapsing beneath it. This pattern appears throughout history. Napoleon suffered defeats before becoming an emperor. Julius Caesar endured setbacks before reshaping Rome. Countless entrepreneurs experienced public failures before building successful companies. Elite athletes lose championships, miss opportunities, face criticism. Yet the most resilient among them possess a psychological advantage. They do not interpret temporary defeat as permanent truth. Their identity exists above individual outcomes. This is known as identity protection. The human mind constantly works to preserve its sense of self. The question is what self it is trying to protect. If your identity is built around being successful, failure becomes devastating. If your identity is built around growth, learning, and persistence, failure becomes information. The event remains the same. The interpretation changes, and interpretation changes behavior. Ronaldo's career offers countless examples of this principle. Public criticism followed him everywhere. Every missed penalty became a headline. Every poor performance became a debate. Every comparison sparked controversy. Entire media cycles revolved around analyzing his weaknesses, questioning his decisions, questioning his personality, questioning his legacy. Many people would have adjusted themselves to avoid criticism. They would have become smaller, safer, more agreeable. But Ronaldo repeatedly returned to the same internal standard. His judgment of himself appeared more important than the judgment of others. That mindset can be dangerous, but it can also be extraordinarily powerful. Because power often belongs to those least dependent on external validation. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. A ruler who depends entirely on public approval becomes controlled by public opinion. A ruler who possesses an independent center of gravity becomes harder to manipulate. This principle extends far beyond politics. It applies to every human life. The more dependent you become on approval, the easier you become to control. Modern society has amplified this reality. Never before have human beings been exposed to so many mechanisms of validation. Likes, comments, followers, algorithms, status, symbols, social recognition. Entire industries profit from convincing people that their worth depends on external responses. The result is subtle but profound. Many people no longer evaluate themselves. They wait to be evaluated. They no longer ask, "What do I think?" They ask, "What will people think?" Over time, self-worth becomes outsourced. Identity becomes rented, and anything rented can be taken away. This is why criticism feels so devastating for many individuals. Not because criticism is powerful, because the identity underneath it is fragile. When your self-image depends on external approval, every negative opinion feels like an existential threat. But Ronaldo appears to operate differently. Whether one admires him or criticizes him, there is an undeniable consistency in his mindset. His standards seem internally generated. His confidence appears connected to personal expectations rather than collective approval. And that distinction changes everything. The moment you stop renting your identity from other people, your life changes. Not because criticism disappears, not because doubt disappears, but because neither becomes your master. Now consider a difficult question. How much of your personality exists because you consciously chose it? And how much exists because it was rewarded? How many beliefs are genuinely yours? How many ambitions belong to you? How many behaviors were adopted simply because they gained approval? This question unsettles people because it threatens the illusion of independence. Most individuals believe they are freely choosing who they become, yet much of human behavior is shaped by invisible incentives, social acceptance, status, recognition, fear of rejection. The strongest identities emerge when a person becomes aware of these forces and chooses deliberately rather than automatically. But there is a final layer to this psychology. A layer that explains why some people continue striving long after success should have satisfied them. A principle shared by kings, warriors, conquerors, and empire builders throughout history. Because eventually, self-belief is no longer enough. There must be something larger than victory itself, something capable of surviving success, something that makes more feel necessary even when you already have everything, and that something is legacy. Why enough is never enough. There comes a point in every extraordinary life when the usual explanations stop working. Money explains ambition for a while, recognition explains effort for a while, status explains sacrifice for a while, but eventually, a strange question emerges. If someone already has wealth, admiration, influence, and achievement, why continue pushing forward? Why keep chasing records after becoming a legend? Why keep seeking more when more is no longer necessary? This question extends far beyond Cristiano Ronaldo. It appears throughout history. Kings who conquered kingdoms continued marching into new territories. Emperors who possessed unimaginable wealth continued expanding their empires. Business leaders who achieved financial freedom continued building. Artists who reached global recognition continued creating. The deeper you study human ambition, the more you realize that success alone rarely satisfies the people who pursue it most intensely. Something else is happening, something older, something deeply human. Most people pursue goals. Exceptional people often pursue permanence. This idea was explored by cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, who proposed one of the most unsettling theories in modern psychology. Human beings are unique because they are aware of their own mortality. Unlike other creatures, we know we will die. We know our time is limited. We know that eventually everything we possess, every relationship we cherish, and every achievement we celebrate will disappear. This awareness creates a psychological burden that few people consciously acknowledge. The knowledge of death silently follows every human life. According to Becker, much of human behavior can be understood as an attempt to manage this burden. Some people cope by seeking comfort. Others cope by seeking distraction. Others seek pleasure. Others seek security. But a certain category of individuals chooses a different path. They seek significance. They attempt to create something that survives them. A legacy, a symbol, a name, an achievement, something capable of extending beyond the boundaries of their physical existence. This is what Becker referred to as symbolic immortality. Not living forever biologically, living forever psychologically. Leaving traces that continue influencing the world after you are gone. When viewed through this lens, many historical mysteries begin to make sense. Why did kings build monuments that required decades to complete? Why did rulers construct massive structures they would never fully enjoy? Why did dynasties obsess over preserving their names across generations? The answer was never merely power. It was permanence. The monument was not stone. It was memory. The empire was not territory. It was immortality. Legacy has always been humanity's attempt to negotiate with death. And perhaps this helps explain something about Ronaldo's relentless pursuit of records. At a certain level of achievement, money no longer explains behavior. Neither does fame. Neither does public approval. The rewards remain, but they become secondary. The pursuit transforms. What matters is no longer what you possess. What matters is what remains. The desire to leave a mark that survives you becomes increasingly powerful. A record is not simply a statistic. It is a statement, a declaration that says, "I was here," and this impulse exists in more people than we realize. Even those who never seek public recognition often want their lives to matter. They want their existence to leave an imprint. The question is how they choose to pursue that desire. Which leads to a difficult challenge. Why do you want what you want? Not the socially acceptable answer. Not the answer that sounds impressive. The real answer. Why do you chase your goals? How many of your ambitions genuinely belong to you? How many were inherited from parents, culture, media, or social expectations? How many desires entered your mind before you were old enough to question them? This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable. Because many people believe they are pursuing success when they are actually pursuing validation, and those are not the same thing. Success emerges from achieving meaningful objectives. Validation emerges from being seen achieving them. One is internal, the other is external. One creates fulfillment, the other creates dependence. The distinction is subtle but profound. A person chasing validation is rarely satisfied. Every achievement demands another audience. Every victory requires another witness. Every accomplishment requires another round of approval. The cycle never ends. But individuals driven by a mission operate differently. Their purpose exists independently of applause. Recognition becomes a byproduct rather than the objective. This is what appears so striking about Ronaldo's mindset. Whether one admires him or criticizes him, there is a persistent sense that he is pursuing something larger than immediate rewards. The goals matter, the trophies matter, the records matter, but they seem connected to a deeper narrative, a long-term mission rather than a short-term reward. And that distinction changes everything. A goal can impress people, a mission can transform a life. Goals have finish lines, missions evolve, goals can be completed, missions become identities. Perhaps this is why enough never feels like enough for certain individuals. They are not chasing the next reward. They are serving a larger story, a story that extends beyond a single season, a single achievement, or even a single lifetime. And once you understand this principle, the final lesson begins to emerge. Because the deepest secret behind kings, conquerors, and legendary competitors is not what they achieve. It is the identity they choose to serve, thinking like a king in a world of spectators. By this point, it should be clear that this story was never really about football. Football is simply the vehicle. The deeper story exists beneath the trophies, beneath the records, and beneath the public image. It is a story about identity, a story about the invisible psychological forces that shape human behavior. Throughout this journey, we have explored several layers of Ronaldo's mindset. The mentality of kingship, the power of rejection, the strength of self-belief, the pursuit of legacy, and beneath all of them, one recurring theme: identity. Because identity is where every major transformation begins, and every major limitation. This is where many people misunderstand the lesson. The purpose is not to become Cristiano Ronaldo. The purpose is not to imitate his personality. The purpose is not to copy his confidence, his routines, or his ambitions. Blind imitation is rarely wisdom. The real lesson is understanding how identity shapes reality. Most people spend their lives reacting. They react to circumstances. They react to criticism. They react to opportunities. They react to fear. Life becomes a continuous series of responses to external events. They wait for motivation before acting. They wait for confidence before committing. They wait for certainty before deciding. And often they wait so long that life quietly passes them by. History reveals a different pattern among those who leave lasting marks on the world. They reverse the process. Instead of allowing circumstances to define identity, they allow identity to define behavior. They decide who they are first, then they force their actions to align with that decision. This does not mean reality becomes easy. It does not mean obstacles disappear. It means their behavior remains consistent even when emotions fluctuate. A person who sees themselves as disciplined behaves differently than someone who hopes to become disciplined. A person who sees themselves as resilient responds differently than someone who wishes they were resilient. Identity changes action. Action changes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce identity, and the cycle continues. This is why personal transformation is often misunderstood. People focus on changing habits, but habits are usually downstream from identity. People focus on changing results. But results are often downstream from behavior, and behavior is often downstream from belief. The deepest change occurs when the story changes, when the internal narrative changes, when the answer to the question, "Who am I?" begins to evolve. Because whether you realize it or not, every human being serves something. Some serve approval. Every decision passes through the filter of what others might think. Some serve comfort. Their primary objective is avoiding discomfort, uncertainty, and risk. Some serve fear, not consciously, but their lives become organized around avoiding loss rather than creating meaning. Some serve status. The endless pursuit of recognition becomes the center of gravity around which everything else revolves. And some serve purpose, a mission, a principle, a vision larger than temporary emotions. The question is not whether you serve, the question is what you serve. That single realization can change the direction of an entire life, because the thing you serve eventually shapes the person you become. Serve comfort long enough, and comfort becomes your prison. Serve fear long enough, and fear becomes your identity. Serve approval long enough, and your self-worth becomes dependent on strangers. But serve purpose long enough, and something extraordinary begins to happen. Your actions become aligned, your attention becomes focused, your energy becomes intentional. You stop drifting, you begin steering. This is why identity matters so much. Not because it sounds inspiring, because it quietly determines thousands of decisions that shape your future. Your future is often hidden inside the story you keep telling yourself. Think about that for a moment. The story you repeat today may become the reality you inhabit tomorrow. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you are incapable, your behavior will eventually reflect it. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you are powerless, your decisions will reinforce it. If you repeatedly tell yourself that growth is possible, your actions begin moving in that direction. The story becomes the blueprint, and most people never question the blueprint they inherited. Which brings us to one final reflection. If someone observed your actions for 1 year, what identity would they conclude you believe in? Not your intentions, not your aspirations, not the version of yourself you describe to others. Your actions. What would they reveal? Would they reveal courage or avoidance, purpose or distraction, discipline or negotiation? This question is uncomfortable because actions rarely lie. They expose the true hierarchy of values operating beneath the surface. But they also reveal something hopeful. Because identities are not fixed, stories can be rewritten, patterns can be interrupted, beliefs can evolve. The person you have been does not permanently determine the person you become, and perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden within Ronaldo's story. Not that greatness belongs to a select few, but that identity is often a choice long before it becomes a reality. The moment a person consciously chooses the story they will live by, everything begins to change. And that realization leads us to the final truth behind the mindset of a king, the invisible kingdom. We began with a question. Why does Cristiano Ronaldo think like a king? After examining the psychology behind his mindset, the answer appears far more profound than football. Because kingship was never really about a throne. It was never about a crown. It was never about status, wealth, or power alone. At its deepest level, kingship is a psychological framework, a way of relating to reality, a way of relating to yourself. It is the refusal to allow circumstances to dictate identity, the refusal to allow criticism to become truth, the refusal to allow rejection to become destiny, the refusal to allow temporary defeat to become a permanent definition. This is the invisible kingdom, the territory no one can see, the battlefield that exists entirely within the human mind. Most people spend years waiting for evidence before believing in themselves. They wait for success before feeling capable. They wait for recognition before feeling valuable. They wait for permission before taking action. And often they remain trapped in that cycle, waiting, watching, hesitating. People like Ronaldo appear to reverse the order. They believe first, then they spend years building evidence. They decide who they are before the world agrees, and whether that belief ultimately succeeds or fails, it changes the way they move through reality. Because identity is never neutral. The story you believe about yourself influences every decision that follows, every risk, every sacrifice, every opportunity, every response to adversity. Throughout history, this principle has shaped kings, conquerors, visionaries, entrepreneurs, artists, and athletes alike. Not because they possessed magical abilities, but because they understood something many people overlook. Reality is experienced through identity, and identity is shaped by the stories we repeatedly tell ourselves. One day, every trophy fades, every record is broken, every empire disappears. Even the greatest names in history eventually become echoes. Time is undefeated, but while no achievement lasts forever, the way a person chooses to think determines every action they take while they are here, and perhaps that is where true power resides. Not in controlling events, not in controlling other people, but in controlling the meaning you assign to events, in controlling the story that guides your life. So, as this journey comes to an end, one final question remains. What story are you living? The one handed to you by circumstances, or the one you consciously choose? Because the answer to that question may shape more of your future than any talent, opportunity, or advantage ever could. You are not what happened to you. You are not the opinions surrounding you. You are not the doubts projected onto you by other people. You are the story you repeatedly choose to believe. And perhaps the rarest form of power is not ruling others, but ruling yourself.